So let's just get right to it. This is one of those messages that'll give you a lot to talk about on the way home. So here's what's true of you, and I don't even know some of you, Unfiltered Radio, glad you're with us, podcasting, watching, you're in the house. Everybody has conflict. So I don't know what that looks like for you. I mean, maybe right now things are pretty stable, but you're either coming out of it, you're in the middle of it with somebody, you're about to be there. It's the coworker, and you're not going to say this publicly, but just so annoying. So you're navigating that. It's a family member that you haven't talked to in 6 months or 6 years. It's a friend, and you just can't figure out how to resolve it, but it's just not the same, and there's just conflict there. But nobody is immune. So every once in a while, you have really good relationships, and seemingly out of nowhere, they go off the rails. We have others that are bad, and we are scratching and clawing to make them better, and then they just get worse. And so you have all of those dynamics, but kind of the sobering reality for all of us is conflict is always right around the corner. I mean, somewhere. It's in a community group, it's in the cubicle next to you, it's in your family somewhere, but it's always coming. And so the question that you got to answer is, what do you do about it? And most of us think we know the answer to that question, and yet in the letter of James that we're going to look at, he's like, you probably don't, because there's some insight around conflict that many of us miss. And so that's the question I want to answer. What do you do? And some of James' insights might be surprising to us. So we'll get to that in just a second. We're in part 3 of this series. You'll be glad you did. I would love for you to go back and actually watch or listen to parts that you've missed. It's on the app. And in fact, on the message part of the app, if you have it, and you should, there is direct links to other resources around the book of James that you can go deeper on. In fact, we have a 3-week study that's ending tomorrow of 30-some people have gone through this book. So I'd love for you to interact with it outside of Sunday. That's a big goal of mine. The other thing I want to tell you about before I dive back in is in 2 weeks, I start a brand new series called My Church. We do this once a year, different content, but it's all about how do you make a church, this church, my church, where it starts to feel like family, it starts to feel like you belong, and even through the summer, our church is growing, and so this is so relevant to so many of you, but also I want to look at a couple things over 2 weeks that legit have the potential to change the trajectory of your life and either your spiritual journey, whether you're curious about Jesus and you're not sure, you followed him for 30 years. So do not miss it over 2 weeks. That starts in 2 weeks, My Church, and it is a great series to invite somebody to come sit with you. So with that said, we're in part 3 of this series, and basically the whole book of James, if you were to find it in the New Testament, is around really practical, you'll be glad you did advice that James gives us. Because all of us can look back on our life and we say things like, well, I'm glad I did that. I'm glad that I followed through, or I wish I had done that, and we've got some regrets from the past. I don't care who you are, you're in that. I'm glad that I didn't. I'm glad that I said no. I'm glad that I ended up didn't date them. I wish that I hadn't done that because now I'm trying to unwind from some of the baggage that I accumulated. But all of us get to a point in life where we recognize that today's decisions and behaviors are going to become tomorrow's realities. And that seems like a no-brainer, but we don't live that way, especially in incremental decisions where somehow we're just not clued into the fact that your present one day is going to be a story about your past and it's going to influence your future. But somehow we live disconnected thinking that we can do one thing and then pray and intend our way into some alternate destination. It just doesn't work that way. The world's set up sow and reap, cause and effect, that whatever direction you're heading, that's where you're going to end up. And so James is like, I want you to take this advice seriously. And here's the thing, when you take the advice that you should take seriously, paying attention to the right habits, who you date, how you handle relationships, relationally, emotionally, the help that you need to get, getting into counseling, getting a budget, whatever your deal is, when you do, you're going to look back and you're going to be glad you did. But the thing that we've said in this series is not only are you going to be glad, the people who are closest to you are going to be glad that you did. I mean, here's the reality. We said this week 1. We are rarely happier than our relationships are healthy. In large part, the quality of your life is determined by the quality of your relationships. And as we're going to see, you can't control all of them. But there is something that you can do even in conflict that sets you up to be able to live the way that God has designed you to live. And so James is like, if you take my advice, it's going to go better for you. So back to what we started with. Everybody knows how conflict interrupts and impacts their life. If you are not happy in a relationship, especially a relationship that's close to you, it robs you of happiness in your life. You're not at peace in a relationship that's close to you, it robs you of peace in regard to the rest of your life. And so James is like, I want to give you this insight on conflict that initially you may push back on, but if you will ever own it, you'll have the potential to make progress. And here's what James says right up front. There is, in any conflict, there is only one source of the conflict. And immediately you're like, no, that's not true. And James is like, well, I wrote the Bible. So, but it is true. Because here's the thing, there's lots of responses and there are lots of different circumstances and there's lots of reasons. So all of that's true. And in fact, I'm going to say this probably 10 times throughout this message. If I were to sit down and hear your story, I probably would be like, wow, that's extreme. That's crazy. I get why you're where you are or why you're hanging on to that. So I get there are extreme situations, extreme context to everything that's going on. But what James said is still true. And that in any conflict, despite the fact that there's lots of reasons, lots of responses, there's really only one source of the conflict. And if we can ever own that or recognize that, we would make progress in regard to peace, even in relationships that don't end peacefully. Because here's the reality, you're not in control of that. Like you don't, it takes two people to reconcile or to end a conflict. So you can't do all of the heavy lifting. But there is a way, if you take James seriously, where you can walk away from a relationship and have peace about the relationship, even if you don't find peace in the relationship. And there's a difference. Meaning, there is a way that you can walk away with your peace and your happiness still intact, despite what they do, if you will take James seriously. So here's how James starts this section of his letter around conflict. And I'm telling you, some of what he says is uncomfortable. If you're, not sure about the Jesus thing, all of this is new to you, don't even know if you have faith. This will help you if you apply it regardless of what, and some of you have experienced some unbelievable hurt in regard to Christians and the church, and so I get it. So I would just say, just start by taking James seriously, and eventually it might lead you to recognize that maybe Jesus actually is the Son of God. So here's what James says in James 4:1. He starts with a question. What causes fights and quarrels among you? Now, initially when I was studying for this, I was like, well, I'll have everybody turn to the person next to them and just ask them this question. Two problems with that. Number one, if you're an introvert like me, that's a nightmare. Okay, so I'll just recognize that. Number two, for some of you who aren't fighting, you would be fighting later today simply by asking this question, right? Like no fight exists currently, but you ask the question and suddenly you're fighting because especially in relationships that you're in regularly with a friend, a spouse, somebody you're dating, coworker, when those relationships show up all the time, there's kind of go-to arguments that just resurface, and everybody has an opinion about how those arguments and conflict originate, right? And so if I were to ask the question, or if you were to ask the question, you'd immediately go to whatever your thing is. Well, they don't listen, and that's always been the problem. They would just start listening, or my parents are too controlling, or my roommate is an absolute mess, irresponsible, and so if they would get their life together, my boss steals my ideas, never gives me any credit, my neighbor won't mow his lawn, and so that's a huge issue. My kids don't listen. If my kids would listen, our home would be happy and everything would be different, and my wife spends too much on Amazon, and so she would knock that off, right? And then we do this, I'll see if anybody of you relate, is that I'm not going to say that I do this, but then you'll get to this place every once in a while and you're like, if everyone would just listen to me, I could help them. You know what I'm talking about? Like if everybody would just take your advice, life would be better for everybody. Like if my kids would just listen to me, spouse would listen to you. Heck, if everybody in culture would just listen to me, the world would be a better place. Anybody? You are liars. You're absolute liars. And here's the thing that we are just like prone to do. We immediately go to blame. And again, I'm going to go through all the caveats of like, yeah, but you don't understand. I don't understand. So just suspend all of that angst for a second because I get your circumstance and that conflict is a big deal. And it is a big deal. Maybe it's all their fault. I'm not taking that from you. But I'm just saying that our default anytime there's conflict is always generally to blame it on somebody else. And it's all them. And if they would just listen to me, I would help straighten their life out. Here's the thing, though, about blame. As long as you blame others for your unhappiness, you will always be unhappy. As long as your constant default initially is, I'm blaming them, that blame keeps you from being unhappy because maybe you've never thought about this, but the thing that you do is you hand, in essence, your happiness and your peace off to somebody else. And then without saying it, you're like, please let me know when I can have this back. Because anytime your peace and your happiness is dependent on what somebody else does, how they respond, whether they see it clearly, whether they apologize, whether they recognize they're an idiot, whether they get their life straightened out, once they do that, we will be at peace and I will be happy again. The only problem with that is you have handed control of your happiness and your peace to somebody else. And you know this already. Sometimes you can spend a lifetime waiting for that thing that never comes to you from that person. And so there is a way to not hand control, even if you don't find resolution, because it's not always possible, to not hand control of your peace and your happiness to somebody else because you are waiting on what you think you need and what they owe you. And sometimes you can wait a lifetime for that. So back to the question, James asked this, so what causes fights and quarrels among you? And what James leads us toward is this idea that I already introduced. There is actually only one source of conflict in any conflict. There's only lots of responses because you're like, no, that can't be true, James, you got it wrong. Well, hang on. Lots of responses, lots of reasons, but there's actually only one source. And James is like, the reason that this kind of doesn't sit well with a lot of us is because you don't understand the nature of conflict. So what causes fights and quarrels among you? And here's what he says. Do they not come from what? Do they not come from your desires that battle within who? And again, immediately, I don't even know your circumstance. You're like, no, it's in them. It's in them. Like it's their thing. And if they would, whatever, and you rehearse all the narratives, and James is like, no, okay, I get it. But they still come. There's still a part of this that comes from your desires that battle within you. James is like, it's in you. You have a desire in you. And you're like, no, it's not a desire. It's an expectation. It's a promise. They said that. Okay, I got it. Chill. We'll get there. But there's still a desire in you in every conflict, even if it's legit, even if they promised, there was a covenant, they said they would, they didn't follow through. Everybody agrees every time I go to lunch and tell my story. I get it all. But there's still a desire in you that is overflowing to the people around you. And I'm just telling you, with all of the pushback, and I get it, the arguing with me in your mind, really, James, if we could just own that one idea, we would make progress. We would gain traction. Then he goes further and he says this, you want something, but you don't get it. And some of us have never thought about this before because one of the things you have to understand about conflict is conflict clouds your judgment. Emotion clouds your judgment. Conflict in the back and forth causes things to be cloudy. None of us have crystal clear insight into all of our life. That's why we need other people. And so James is like, you want something and don't get it, meaning every time there's a conflict, there's something that you want and you're not getting. And again, you're like, no, I deserve it. No, that might be true. No, they promised. No, I get it. They promised. You're owed it. Everybody would agree. They've been a jerk. I'm not taking any of that from you. It still doesn't negate what James is leading us toward. There's still something that you want that you're not getting in any conflict. And then he says this, you want something, but you don't get it. So you do what? You kill. That was a little weak. Let me try that one more time. You do what? It's bold. It's all caps. You kill. Now, this is where like understanding how to read literature is helpful with the Bible. Not everybody does, and there's poetry and there's hyperbole, and all of that's where most of the misinterpretation comes from when people read the Bible. This is hyperbole. Jesus is like, these people are not on death row. This is though what you have experienced or what you've watched other people experience. And some of you, your stories are heartbreaking. What James is leading us toward is there's some relationships where you want something so badly out of the relationship. And there's some relationships where you want something out of the other person or from the other person so badly that inadvertently you will kill the relationship to try to get it. And we've all experienced that. We've watched parents kill a relationship with their adult kids and there is no relationship any longer. And they disguised as a lot of it as, well, I just wanted their best. I just wanted them to reach their full potential. I just wanted them to maximize. But really it was something about them. We've watched people criticize somebody else into submission. We've watched men kill the self-image of a woman. We've watched parents obliterate relationship. We've seen friends destroy a relationship. We've watched people kill and destroy relational connection because they wanted something so bad from that person and so bad from the relationship that the relationship can't withstand it. And if I were to be really honest, and this is a little bit hard and a little bit of twist in the knife. Some of you, if we're to be really, really honest, you're there right now. You're in that place right now. You're heading toward what James is talking about right now. And a lot of times this is subtle and we disguise it. Well, I just want their best. I just want them to reach their potential. Well, they promised, they said, I deserve. And some of that may be true. But in a lot of cases, there's the thing that you say you want or it's for them, and I just desire their best. And yet about 3 layers below that, you'll find it maybe isn't about their education. It's about your identity. It maybe isn't about just how they're responding to the relationship. It's the fact that there's some insecurity around your self-worth that you're trying to get from them. And not in every case, but in some cases when you stop long enough to recognize there's actually some of this that's my identity, my fulfillment, my needs. And even if it's not all my deal, it's still like 95% them. There's something that I'm trying to get. And if you leave that unchecked long enough, not only will you forfeit the opportunity if there is potential for peace in that relationship, you will kill and destroy the relationship trying to get what you want. I mean, do you know why we hurt the people who are closest to us? Because they're closest to us. This is my favorite Thomas Merton quote. He says this, that the beginning of love is to let those who love be perfectly themselves, not to twist them to fit our own image. Otherwise, we only love the reflection of ourselves that we find in them. And this isn't to eliminate like legit needs, legit promises, legit expectations. This is not to take any of that off the table, but immediately sometimes our go-to, it's them. No, maybe some of this is you. Maybe some of this is me, and the nature of conflict is emotion. It's clouded judgment. Maybe there's a part of it, even if it's 5%, that you've never really seen before. And can you imagine, I mean, even if you're still arguing with me in your mind, can you imagine if we could just own that one idea, what could happen in marriage relationships? What could happen in your first marriage? What could happen in some of our homes? Heck, what could happen in neighborhoods and in culture if we would just embrace that one powerful idea from James? Here's what he says to finish verse 2. You want something, but you don't get it, so you kill, and then you do what? And you covet. All that means is every single person has been hardwired with desire. And those desires are not bad. Every good desire can be distorted. And in fact, God created us with a ton of really good desires for love and affection and security and pleasure and worth. And all of those things are actually God ordained, God created. But you can take any good desire and outside of that, the right context, that good desire can be distorted. And so what he's saying is there's desires that you have that become appetites. And here's the nature of an appetite. An appetite is never fully and finally satisfied. That's how appetites work. And outside of the right context, appetites for really good things like pleasure and worth and security and desire, those appetites, when you feed them, the more that they grow. And if unchecked, eventually you get to the place where you have desires that you are trying to eke out of or gain from another person or another relationship. And so James says, so you in some cases kill the relationship and you covet because you have an appetite for more that you are now trying to get out of some other person. And it might be that that other person doesn't even have that thing to give you. So you can't have what you want. And so James is like, so you're right back where you started, and you quarrel and you fight and you can't figure out how to move forward. Here's the thing, and this is so hard to do. This is so much easier for me to say than do, so I get it. But on the verge of a conflict, right before it gets heated again, you've had the same conversation 31 times. If you could get to the place at some point along the way, and just this is rarefied air. A lot of people just never get there. But just to own exactly what James is saying, that with all the emotion, and I can't believe them, and if you heard my story, and just go, you know what part of the problem is here? I'm not getting what I want. And my want is legit, and I deserve it. And we walked an aisle, and they said, and they, all of the things, or they, when we agreed and I signed on the deal to go into the partnership for this business. I mean, all of that might be true, but you still have to acknowledge it. You know what part of the problem is here? I'm not getting what I want. So just like we did last week, I want us to practice this. Last week is we had to practice, I'm so sorry, and then period. I want to practice a statement because this is so foreign, and for some of us, we've never uttered this before, and I'm not even asking you to utter this to another human being. You just need to talk to yourself about this. So on the verge of a conflict, can we just say this together? You know what part of the problem is here? Okay. Same thing happened first service. Apparently, I give terrible instructions when it comes to any kind of crowd feedback. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to say, you know what part of the problem is, and then you're going to repeat it. And I'll repeat it. It's not your fault. Same thing happened in the first service. If the student hasn't learned, the teacher hasn't taught. So you know what part of the problem is here? Okay. So here's what we're going to do. Next time I'm going to diagram it when I ask this again. So here, I'm going to say, you know what part of the problem is here? And then I'm going to pause, and then you're going to say the exact line I just said. You with me? You got me? And then, yeah, thank you. And then I'm going to say, then you're going to say it, and then I'm going to say I'm not getting what I want, and then I'm going to pause, and you're going to say that. You got me? Okay, let's try this. I'm going to count to 3 because I feel like we need it. 1, 2, 3. You know what part of the problem is here? You know what part of the problem is here? Yes. I'm not getting what I want. Okay, I'm just going to end there because that was pretty good. It's hard to say. And for some of you, your initial reaction is, I wish my middle schooler was in here. I wish my coworker could hear this. I wish my neighbor. There you go again. And I get it. And send them the podcast. Though that's difficult when you're dealing with conflict to send that to somebody. Hey, I just thought you might benefit from this. So I don't know how you're going to do that. But this is about you. And this is the problem. We never get to that place. So even as you're filtering this through your mind, you're thinking about the other person that needs to hear this and how much better they would be if they could just do what ultimately James is talking about. But this is about you. This is about us. And here's why it's so difficult. When you just acknowledging that in that conflict, you're not getting what you want, that acknowledgement is powerful. And I'm not talking about who ultimately is at fault and it's 95-5 or it's 98-2 and it's not even worth talking about. It's all them. But just still acknowledging, even if it's not even the conflict or origination of the conflict, but it's your response to the conflict, anytime you acknowledge that part of that conflict is the fact that you are not getting what you want or what you think you deserve. Just that acknowledgement is powerful. It causes you to gain traction. And what many times you discover is that part of the conflict or the response is yours to own. Years ago, and I don't do this as much anymore because I'm not great at it. When I would sit down with people who are in conflict and I would try to manage that. Now we have incredible counselors and people that we send people to, and they're just much better and nicer than I am. And so I would sit down and I would go, okay, let's just try to gain some traction. I'm gonna draw a circle, and I want you to just own what is yours in the conflict. Like when you're sitting down with two people, and so I would draw. It'd be something like this, and I would start with like maybe 25%. And I would just keep working down towards barely a sliver. I'm like, is it just this maybe? And I'm not over exaggerating. Nobody would ever draw anything on the pie. Ever. They wouldn't even draw a line. Just like, could it just be a cut in the pie? They'd never do it. They'd never own any of it. And you're like, I mean, seriously, 100% of it is them. But nobody would ever do it. And I'll tell you why. This is so difficult to own any of your part of the pie in conflict. Because again, it's emotional. The more extreme it is, the easier it is to ignore that you had any part of it. Because I mean, again, just look at them. Look at what they did. Look at how they've responded. And so it's not even worth acknowledging. And when you acknowledge, here's what happens. A little bit, even if it's like 3%, a little bit of your argument goes away. A little bit of the energy goes away. A little bit of your, maybe just a little bit, but a little bit of your angst goes away because it is much easier to tell a story that's 100% them. And I don't even have to slow down. There is no speed bumps to the end. I can just tell how incredibly off they are and they need Jesus and they need to understand, how wrong they've been. But when I have to slow down, even for a 5% speed bump to go, I did have a part in that, or man, the way I responded, it just slows your story down. It slows the momentum down. It slows the traction down, and it causes you to have to focus on you. And James is like, that's the point. Even if it's heavily weighted in their direction, you've never actually looked at you because of what they've done and how extreme it is and how wrong you think they are. It's just easy to ignore. Who needs to own 5%? My 5% is not going to change this conflict or relationship. And James is like, but it will change something in you, and it will have an impact into every future relationship. And again, you're like, yeah, but again, they promised, they owed me, I deserve it, we decided it's not fair. Just pause for a second. Just be careful with the it's not fair language. Just be careful with the it's not fair language. Because generally, and this is kind of, messed up human nature, most of the time we don't care what's fair until it's not fair for us. I'll give a dumb example, but nobody's rolling into Costco waiting 15 minutes for a parking spot, and everybody, there's 15 cars rolling around that parking lot, and then somehow you get the front spot, right? You cut somebody off to do it, but you get the front spot. Nobody gets into that parking spot and starts pounding the steering wheel like, it's not fair. They've been circling for 15 minutes and I got the front spot. It's just not fair. No, what do? You pull in, you're like, thank you, God, for your blessings and for providing this for me. Like, you don't care about anybody else rolling around the parking lot. Just be careful with the it's not fair language. And James is like, come on, if you could ever, even in extreme circumstances, get there and acknowledge that part of the problem is I'm not getting what I want. There might be a part of this that's a little bigger behind all of the emotion than I ever realized. And if you could just acknowledge that one point, it would be powerful. And so he doesn't end there. You don't have because you don't ask God. And this is not some cliche, well, you just pray about it. Like, oh, I knew that's where it was going. That's not really what James is saying. But before you send the angry text, before you throw everything off the bed again to make the point, before you go crazy, before you lash out with the kind of pre-rehearsed speech that, the conflict always goes in that direction. James, like, have you ever thought about, really bringing this to God and not bringing this to God where you pray at someone? That's different. Have you ever thought about at the level of your desires and what you're not getting and what you think you deserve? With again, at some level, you might be right. Have you ever thought about naming that? Because you just immediately go to whatever the surface issue is. Like, well, they're just whatever. And every time, and they were more responsible. And I can't believe they talked to me that way. And they came in late again. That's generally not your issue. There's something else behind it. Have you ever thought about just bringing that to God? This is James' point, and going, God, I want them to, and then fill in the blank. And some of those answers might be deep. Some of those might feel more surface level. God, I just want them to follow through. And the fact that they won't is causing unbelievable conflict in this relationship. And I think they're in the wrong, but I want them to follow through. I want them to give credit. They don't ever give me credit. I want them to acknowledge what they've done. I want them to get home early. I want them to break up with the idiot. I want them, whatever your thing is, but seriously, God, I want them to fill in the blank, name it, be as specific as possible, and I'm not getting it. And I'm struggling with that. And there's a lot of emotion. But I'm going to do that first rather than pray at them. And pray at them usually looks like, God, just help them to see where they're off. God, if you need to, light them up and bring them back. God, James, no, I want you to go to you first. Because when you do this, when you own any of that pie, generally what happens? This is why we don't do it. The piece of the pie actually expands a little bit. And sometimes that step to acknowledge was the step that has been missing, where potentially you become the catalyst for relational healing that neither of you thought was possible. And so when you ask, verse 3, you don't receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may, what's the word? You may spend what you get on your own pleasures. Basically, you're praying at them, and it's all about all of your desires. So what if you came to God legitimate, and they're like, God, I want you to deal with me around what I actually want. And for some of us, I'm going to say many of us, we've never done that. We've never acknowledged that. But God, I want you to deal in this area, because if you can begin to do that, you'll begin to make progress. And I just want to give you this little bit of insight. It's not always, but there's certain relationships where this is true. In certain relationships, because there is lack of clarity there and there's so much emotion, you've never really recognized what you actually want. And there are certain cases where actually what you want, that relationship cannot give it to you. In fact, there's certain things sometimes that we want that no human being can ever give it to us. Like there is no marriage relationship that is going to complete you. There is no human being that can stand up under the crushing weight of being your security, your identity, your worth, or whatever else you're looking for. And it's exactly James' point, because in some circumstances, you'll realize it's less their fault than I realize. And in fact, I'm putting a crushing weight of human expectation on somebody who can't carry those expectations. So James is like, have you ever taken this to God? Can you take no for an answer? And have you been willing to own your part of the conflict? Because as long as you are trying just unchecked, as long as you're not willing to acknowledge any of this, you will continue to squeeze all of those things out of relationships, and you will always have conflict. So let me just ask you this question, and I'll get ready to land this. For some of you, I just want to ask you this. Who potentially, maybe this isn't relevant to you, but for some of you, many of us it is. Who potentially is suffering because you aren't getting your way? Who potentially is suffering because if you're honest, you're not getting your way. And again, it's disguised as, well, I just want them to be more productive. So we have to have this conversation again. I just want them to give more time. All I'm asking is for respect. Every human being deserves respect, and they're not respecting. Or if they would just see things the way that I see them. Or if they would just finish their education. And it's all about them. But maybe it's not about as much about them as you thought. Some of this is about you. It's what you want, what you deserve, what you desire. But our initial kind of default is just blame everything on them before we've done any of the hard work. And again, that's James' point. And let me just say this and I'll move on. Blame is so dangerous because blame allows you or enables you to smuggle your issues into your future. And what happened, I'll tell you why it's a big deal. Even in the relationships that are never going to be healed, where it really is, it's like 2% you, 98% them. You're like, me doing the hard work of the 2% is not going to change the trajectory of this. It might not. That relationship may not survive. That friendship may not survive. I don't know. But I'm telling you, this is still a worthwhile investment because in that part that you need to own it, it can get lost and overshadowed by all of their unhealth. But the problem is that little part that you haven't acknowledged and you haven't owned, you're carrying that with you into every other relationship and season of your life. And boom, there it shows up in the marketplace. Boom, there it shows up in the second marriage. Oh, there it showed up in my relationship with my kids because everywhere you go, there you are. And so regardless of that particular relationship, you need to own what is yours rather than blame, because blame will allow you to smuggle your issues into your future, and blame will set you up for a repeat experience. I can't tell you how many times, man, people are changing churches and community groups and marriages and different areas of the country, and we're going to move here, and it's going to be slower pace and less hustle and bustle, and everything's going to be better. And suddenly they realize they never did any of the hard work. A new location, a new church, a new relationship are not going to solve your problems. And James is like, I want you to focus in on this. And here's the thing. For some of us, this is kind of sobering, there's people around us, they already know your issues. And they just have been waiting for you to acknowledge it. They're like, yeah, we've seen that for a while. But we're just waiting for you to own it. What would happen in that friendship with your brother, coworker, son, daughter? So here's what I would encourage you to do. I'm a journaler. Not everybody's a journaler, so that's fine. This is not personality specific. But as much as possible, I would encourage you to sit down and write this down. And wherever there's a conflict now is to get really specific and do some hard work. And it might take some days or even some weeks to there's some stuff in here about what I want, what I deserve, that I've never really acknowledged. And just draw a circle and own what's yours. Now, I'll just tell you, nobody ever does this. It's never 50-50. And so I'm just going to acknowledge nobody has a 50-50 conflict in here. So just skip that slide. Because when it's 50-50, you have no argument, right? There's no back and forth, there's no, so even 25, but I'm just gonna tell you, nobody does 25 either, because the moment you own 20, that's too much. And some of your argument goes away, and some of your emotion goes away. It's just not a good conversation. Well, yeah, 25% of this is me. It just slows you down too much. So even if this is what I'm recommending, just that. Just own that, and then all the rest, just start there. And you need to start in private, and you need to do what James said. You need to start with God. What is in here that I haven't acknowledged yet? And then you can just blame all the other orange on somebody else for right now. My entire industry, They're all terrible. Like everybody around me, I can't believe, I mean, 3 generations of just people who are off the rails in my family, and I'm the only one who thinks clearly. And if they would have all, that's fine. But you need to own something. And here's why this is so difficult. Because the moment, again, you own anything, the temperature goes down just a little bit. The energy goes down just a little bit. The momentum goes down just a little bit. And you have to focus on you. But for some of you, the only thing that you focused on is your ex, the business partner, the teacher, that conflict with your friend. And it has not made it better, and it has not made you better. In fact, you are more angrier than you've ever been. So let me just ask you a couple questions. And I came up with these the last minute this morning because I just thought about them, and I just felt like we needed a little more help. So let me give you these couple questions, and then we'll end. But here's the first one. In regard to owning your piece of the pie, I had a feeling something wasn't right, but I wanted to do it anyway. And see, you've hidden behind the huge, the orange piece of, but I mean, the fact that they went back on their word, the fact that they negated the contract, it was unethical, they whatever. And there's this whole story, and you are 100% right. They did all of those things. You know what your part of the pie that you've never owned was? What actually preceded the decision. And the part that you need to own is you had a feeling that something wasn't right before you ever got there. And you decided you wanted to do it anyway. And you have to own that. Second question is, people I trusted warned me, and I just wouldn't listen. And it is their fault. And every time I rehearse my story over coffee, people are like, you need to leave them. And it's just craziness. And there's so much conflict. And I mean, everybody agrees they're a little off the rails emotionally. But if I were to be honest, I had 3 people that I've trusted in every other season of my life. And they were telling me kind of some warning shots of what I need to do and not do. And I just wouldn't listen to them. And I have to own that part of this. Or should have got an Uber, but I was too embarrassed. And they put pressure on me and this whole thing. And I'm, it's that one guy. And my whole story is about blaming him. But I'll be honest, I knew I was embarrassed. I made a terrible decision. And I have to own that part of my decision. Or last one, I kept saying I could handle it. I didn't need help. I didn't need counseling. I could handle it. I got it. I'm good. And yet I knew even as I was saying that I couldn't handle it. And I lied to myself. And I have to own that. And James basically is like, before you enter back into it, before you go to that person, would you just pray this prayer? And this is your takeaway. God, give me clarity about what I need to own and what I really want before I try to get that from them. God, we just pray this prayer. God, give me clarity about what I really want before I try to get it from them. And I'm just going to tell you, owning your part, your piece of the pie, gives you clarity for the future. One of my favorite verses from the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Meaning, when you take God seriously around what he says, James around what he says under the inspiration of the Spirit of God, you have clarity where you didn't previously have clarity. But when you hide from something or you hide from owning your part of the blame, any time you hide from something, there's a part of you that is unavailable to someone. It's why owning sets other people free as well. And so listen, owning your piece is what leads you to own your piece. Owning your piece of the pie, your part of the blame, even if it's my response or this is what I want, this is what I'm after, this is what I feel like I'm owed. Owning your piece is what leads you to owning your piece, where you take back your peace and your happiness, that you ultimately discover peace about a relationship, even if you don't find peace in a relationship. Because when you do your part, when you own what God is leading you to own, even if it does not end peacefully, you can walk away without living your entire life waiting for somebody else to respond, waiting for somebody else to apologize, waiting for somebody else to see the error of their ways when they may never get to that place of help. And James is like, I want you to go free. I mean, Jesus gave us the promise. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. And that is not hinging on circumstances or other people's unhelp. You have control of where God wants to lead you in terms of life and peace and happiness. But it only happens when you are willing to do what God has called you to do, so that you can walk away and they may never change. But they will not sabotage and be control your peace and your happiness for the rest of your life. So would you just go to God to go, God, I want you to deal with what I want here before I go there. And God, I want you to move in me around what you want to do in me before I try to go and get that from them. And God, would you help me to own what is mine to own and own what you want to do in my heart and my life? And the promise is just this: sometimes it's going to be embarrassing. Sometimes it's going to be emotional. And you will lose a part of your well-crafted argument. And it's not going to have as much energy. And eventually, you will look back and you will have clarity about your future and your future relationships, and you will be free. And James would say, and you will be glad you did. Would you pray with me? Jesus, thank you for what you're doing in this moment. I constantly quote this verse, but it is true, and there's certain moments where we feel it more than others, and that is in Hebrews, where it says that your word is living and is powerful, sharper than a two-edged sword, cuts to the division of soul and spirit, and it exposes us. And so sometimes that cut initially is painful, but it's always accompanied with your grace because you're leading us into something better. And so I pray wherever this hits that you would just give us wisdom to know specifically and accurately what to do with it, and just give us the courage to act and help us to do it sooner rather than later. And we pray all of this in the powerful name of Jesus. Amen.